How you can activate your internal wealth DNA to attract money to you effortlessly. Starting as soon as today in this short video, I'm going to tell you why that little known fact is the key to making you insanely wealthy. I'm going to share how a chance encounter with a rogue NASA scientist. Hi, my name is Alex Maxwell. I was broke for just about my entire adult life. I also worked 2 jobs for a long time thinking I'd get ahead. But something always came up that would keep me broke. I couldn't even afford to buy my youngest daughter Alexis anything for her birthday. She was turning 5 that year and wanted a bicycle more than anything in the world. But I had to choose between the bike she wanted or paying the heat bill. And the heat bill won. It was humiliating enough to try and beg and borrow the money before her birthday arrived. Not knowing what to do, I decided to go for a drive. For whatever reason, I decided to go to a local dive bar and just be alone. After downing a couple $2 Bud Lights, I couldn't help but notice one guy at the end of the bar. He kept pulling a piece of paper out, putting it back in his bag over and over again. Something told me to go sit and chat with this guy. So I walked over and introduced myself, and he told me his name was Jim. As the conversation went on, I noticed he kept glancing over at his bag. Finally, I worked up the nerve to ask him about it. Jim looked around the room, leaned in, and lowered his voice. "Look man, I got fired from NASA." He told me one night he was working late when he stumbled across some documents that were left out. And that's how he discovered NASA had a secret they were hiding from the public. The billionaire's secret, and this secret holds the key to becoming rich beyond your wildest dreams. They strongly believed for centuries that the root chakra is responsible for wealth or wealth DNA. Jim told me if you activate wealth DNA, you will never have to worry about money again. It will just flow into your life effortlessly. I said to Jim, "So, we humans possess a wealth gene in our spiritual DNA, and it just needs activating." Jim looked me in the eye and smiled. "God, I can only imagine what kind of crazy scientific procedure it would take to pull that off." Jim looked me in the eye and smiled. "God, I can only imagine what kind of crazy scientific procedure it would take to pull that off." And actually, its basis goes even further back than that. There was a Greek philosopher named Pythagoras. And he used to prescribe music as medicine. He referred to it as sacred geometry. Jim assured me NASA has proven it's possible. Right then Jim pulled out the page of notes he'd gotten from the NASA scientists. The notes were written in code, so he doesn't know what the frequencies are. Or really anything else, it said. After Jim told the last part about the code and being stuck, I suddenly thought of my nephew. He was a bright young man who served as a military intelligence officer in the Army. Jim didn't hesitate to jump at the opportunity. 2 days later we met up with my nephew at a coffee shop in town, where Jim and I told him about the secret NASA wealth DNA code. He agreed and took a copy of the notes home and promised to look it over. The very next night he called me up and said he'd immediately cracked part of the code. He told he identified 2 specific numbers. Why were there 2 different frequencies? Jim and my nephew decided, what if we listened to both frequencies at the same time? The next day the 3 of us tried out my theory. That night we agreed to meet up at the dive bar to discuss our experiences from that day. Nothing had changed for me or Jim, just another crappy day. But my nephew came skipping in with a huge grin on his face. Turns out he got a huge promotion at the FBI, which came with a hefty pay raise and a window office in Hawaii. Jim looked at my nephew and gushed, "Your wealth DNA, you've activated it. It works." We immediately started discussing why it was working for my nephew but not Jim and I. Turns out my nephew did one thing slightly different than Jim and I. Fast forward to a few months later. All 3 of us had been using the headphone method to listen to the 2 different frequencies at the same time. And we all experienced a complete transformation in our lives. My nephew signed a $1 million publishing deal to write a book about his experience working in the FBI, allowing him to retire from the FBI shortly afterward. It's a complete transformation in our lives. My nephew signed a $1 million publishing deal to write a book about his experience working in the FBI, allowing him to retire from the FBI shortly afterward. Jim promptly won $500,000 on a scratch-off lotto ticket and bought a bunch of Bitcoin when it was low. He turned around and sold it 6 weeks later at a $3.2 million profit. As for me, I'd found that my great-aunt died and left me a $247,000 inheritance. So I felt like it was safe to say that we've activated our wealth DNA. We didn't stop there. We tried the same thing with other family members. And one by one, we activated their wealth DNA, and one by one their lives were transformed virtually.